new federal law is about to require contractors to map their supply chains, vet their vendors, and prove they're not relying on banned biotech companies. Many firms will discover exposure they didn't know they had. We'll explain what's at stake with Alex Major, partner and co-chair of the Government Contracts and Global Trade Practice at McCarter English. Mr. Major, thank you so much for joining me.
Thank you very much for having me.
There is a part of the National Defense Authorization Act for 2026 that I want to ask you about, the BIOSECURE Act. What is this and why is it so important?
The BIOSECURE Act is a kind of a unique provision. It's really a supply chain visibility and federal funding compliance regime that is intended to cut across the industry. And its intent really is to safeguard U.S. national security by restricting federal agencies from engaging with certain biotechnology entities. And it's pretty broad and pretty wide-reaching.
Well, in fact, that broad definition is part of what may make this challenging. It's everything from lab equipment to cloud tools. If you're a contractor and you don't think you have anything to do with biotechnology, how should you approach this?
Yeah, that's the key issue here. The Act really does broadly define biotechnology equipment or services. So focusing on what they're talking about, really, it's instruments and devices that could be used in research, development, production, or analysis of biological materials. And that would include things like components and necessary software or firmware. We can get into that in a little bit. But it also addresses services related to data storage, transmission, COVID's still in the rear view, so disease detection, genealogical information, which I know is a lot of all the rage, and then consulting or support services tied to biotechnology equipment. So there really is quite a big or a long tail to this, and the expansive definition really does encompass a wide range of things like laboratory platforms, sequencing technology, bioinformatic tools, and data handling infrastructures. So it is pretty broad.
So some of that, if you were in the business, you'd know and you'd be thinking about those kinds of things. But you mentioned software and firmware. Say a little bit more about that.
Yeah, so this is where I think a lot of companies might find themselves in a bad situation when they say, "Oh, we're a technology firm, we're a software firm, or we're a defense contractor." Right? We don't do biotechnology. We're not biotechnology. That's pharma or whatever. But if you're a defense contractor, so for example, that builds aircraft maintenance software, right, for the DoD. You're not a biotech company. Your product is logistics and maintenance tracking. But inside your systems, maybe there's one module that handles something like occupational health monitoring for maintenance crews. And that module uses a third-party cloud analytic, process blood test data for exposure to hazardous materials, right? Something like that. Then, honestly, that analytics vendor uses an outsourced biomarker analysis process for biological samples. The prime contractor is performing federal work. Biological data is being processed somewhere in the performance chain. The biotech capability is outsourced and buried deep in the infrastructure. So therefore, if any vendor in the chain is later designated a biotechnology company of concern, that prime contractor is on the hook for possibly violating the BIOSECURE Act. So the key point here is that prime contractor, they never intended to do biotech. We're not a biotech company. But biological data processing was still a part of how that federal work was performed. And that's exactly the kind of hidden supply chain risk the Act is designed to service.
It sounds like you could be playing 6 degrees of separation for a really long time with this rule.
You really can. You really can. And it's going to hit everyone, right? I mean, the important part of the product here is there somewhere where this technology touches biotechnology?
Well, one of the things I suspect will clarify that is that OMB and GSA have to write the rules, and part of the rules will be a companies of concern list. Is that correct?
Correct. There's two things that companies need to look for in their supply chain. First, they can do it right now. They can go to 1260H, which is the Chinese military concern list. And there are already some biotechnology companies already on there, and that was actually the impetus for a lot of this. BGI Genomics and some others are already identified as Chinese military companies operating in the United States that could affect this. But then you're right, there's going to be a separate list that OMB is putting together that can designate entities of BCC, so biological companies of concern, based on criteria such as foreign adversary control, involvement in biotech, and potential national security risks. So it's not just relegated to China. It could be much broader.
I'm speaking with Alex Major. He's a partner and the co-chair of the Government Contracts and Global Trade Practice at McCarter English. So once all of those pieces fall into place, we have FAR rules, we have companies of concern list. What do you think contractors will actually have to certify, and how will this sort of roll out in everyday practice?
Well, we're not going to see it for a little bit. So the good news here is that companies have until June of 2028 to get there. That should not be a sigh of relief. That should be oh my gosh, we've got a lot of work. It's like marathon training. But really, I think once they do that, it's going to be the same sort of issues that they face now with a lot of their compliance obligations, that you're going to be seeing a lot of implied certifications, right? This is material to this national security concerns, I think the government would argue. So as a result, they're just going to expect you do it, like you're doing with Kaspersky, like you're doing with Huawei, like you're doing with other portions of Chinese military companies, where you have an understanding and visibility into your supply chain. So it's very important for companies and universities and grant research institutions to understand their supply chain and where this could affect them.
We're seeing a lot of focus these days on supply chain compliance in a variety of fashions. As you talk about companies mapping their supply chains early, tell us a little bit more about where they should be focused, what they should be looking for, and how they should be taking maybe corrective action now to get ahead of this 2028 implementation rule.
Yeah, I think with this one in particular, right? This is another rung on that compliance ladder, that supply chain ladder. But they really, companies and universities, and I can't stress that. I've seen it a lot with the universities and research hospitals because it does affect grants as well as federal contracts. You really need a map where biotechnology touches the business, right? And that includes downstream tiers. You have to understand, where that biotechnology rub is, and then also assess foreign ownership, control, and influence risk across your vendors. Are there vendors that, and again, this is such a volatile market where there's acquisitions, weekly of companies like this. So you need to figure that out, and it really comes down to focusing on where biosecure risk will show up contractually in your systems. And maybe it's programmatic, maybe it's by contract, but it really comes down to understanding where or if your technology or service attaches to anything related to what could be considered biotechnology. And then, just validate your ability to make future certifications and representations that need to be made.
When you gave us an example at the beginning of this conversation, it was several layers of embedded technology and software. Let's say a company gives this their very best shot. They have done their very best comprehensive review, and they still don't find something that comes up later in a compliance check. What does that mean? What do the rules allow? What provisions will cover that?
Yeah, well, the rules are still being built. Obviously, we won't see the FAR amendment until probably 2028. So long as OMB meets their guidance. We've had some problems with that lately. But what you're going to see at the very least is probably, if you find out about it or when you find out about it, a mandatory disclosure obligation, because you are supposed to meet these requirements, or you will be required to meet these requirements. So it's not in the FAR yet, but it is coming out. So in regards to what happens if and when, still remains to be seen. But really, the implication could be that your supply chain goes on halt. And once you find it, you need to immediately pivot to find a new source. And that becomes very problematic, especially as you're proceeding and trying to perform your contract. So understanding those pivot points, or at least understanding where you need to be when that happens, or if that happens, is going to be imperative. And again, this is not just focused on China. It can be any number of quote unquote national security requirements.
Do you think this is kind of a tip of the iceberg? Will the scope expand? Will other sorts of technologies be brought into similar sorts of agreements?
That's a good question. I don't know. I think this is interesting because where we can talk about it from the Department of Defense standpoint, don't forget this is a FAR clause. So we will see this in agriculture. We will see this affecting pharmaceutical companies that are just responding to government contracts or federal funding or federal research dollars. So it really does remain to be seen how far and where else we'll see supply chain issues go. This has been brewing for a couple of years now, but this one is going to be rather expansive, I think.
I've been speaking with Alex Major. He's a partner and co-chair of the Government Contracts and Global Trade Practice at McCarter English. Thanks so much for joining me.
Thank you so much for having me.
We'll post this interview at federalnewsnetwork.com/Federal Drive. Subscribe to the Federal Drive wherever you get your podcasts.